World War II was such a defining moment in human history, and photographs taken during this time capture incredible moments of heroism, tragedy, and triumph of the era. Every person in these photographs represent a life journey. What cannot be captured by a camera is the total depth of their suffering, emotions, and tragedies they have had to endure. These images don't just tell individual stories, but echo the collective suffering of an entire generation and society at large. Each face, each moment frozen in time, is a reminder of the suffering and pain of millions of individuals whose own stories have been lost to history. Those who suffered unimaginable cruelty and never got to tell their stories. Phyllis Latour Doyle, also called Pippa, is known for her remarkable bravery as a secret agent. She was the last surviving female spy of World War II. She died in 2013 in Auckland, New Zealand, at the age of 102. Born on 8th April 1921 in Durban, South Africa, to a French father and a British mother. She later moved to New Zealand with her family. During World War II, at the age of 23, Pippa volunteered to join the SOE, a British spy organization that conducted espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in Nazi-occupied Europe. Her unit, known as F Section, gathered crucial intelligence about the Germans' movements in France, and also cut railway lines and telephone cables, which forced the Germans to send their messages over the airwaves, allowing them to be intercepted and decoded in England. Pippa was parachuted into France in 1944, just before the D-Day invasion. Using the code name Genevieve, she posed as a 14-year-old girl selling soap. The German soldiers hated their soap, which apparently was like sandpaper, so her goat's milk soap was in high demand. She would bicycle through Nazi-occupied areas, gathering and transmitting crucial intelligence for the Allied forces on a secret broadcasting device. Despite the constant danger of capture and execution, Pippa successfully relayed valuable information, contributing to the success of the Allied operations. Other spies who had been caught were tortured and executed in the most horrific ways, and Pippa herself had many close calls. At one checkpoint, she was strip-searched by a female Gestapo officer while she had the radio codes sewn into a shoelace that she used to tie up her hair. She removed the lace just before the officer ran her fingers through her hair. On another occasion, she was held captive by 2 German soldiers who assaulted her sexually and was rescued by a Nazi commanding officer. She also witnessed many civilians being executed. Her bravery and dedication were recognized after the war, and she was awarded several honors, including the French Croix de Guerre and the British Member of the Order Medal. For decades, she told no one, not even her family, of what she had accomplished, and also refused to be interviewed. In one interview, she exclaimed, "Why would I want to remember that?" Only recently, she decided to open up and share her experiences. Even before Britain declared war with Germany in September 1939, the government had put plans into place in recognition of the dangers that lay ahead, which included building new warships. hundreds of people show up to witness the launching of Royal Navy battleship HMS Prince of Wales in Birkenhead, Merseyside on 3rd May 1939. During the early days of Britain's war with Germany, in anticipation of bombings and gassings, more than 500,000 children were evacuated from London. The children were sent to stay with volunteer foster parents in the British countryside. In the weeks to follow, there was a weirdness around the city, suddenly devoid of children playing in the streets. Londoners were interviewed by journalists to record their reactions and thoughts at the time. Many people either regretted sending their children away, while others felt guilty for not sending their kids out of the city. People didn't know what to do, and many felt abandoned by their government. One woman interviewed stated, "No, we didn't send a child away because we haven't one to send." Oh, can you understand this war? Tell me why it had to come, spoiling our lives. Tell me. Perhaps we shall never have a child now. Never. Another woman, a reporter spoke with, refused to believe the Germans would bomb London. Her words eerily foreshadowed the death toll that the war would take across Europe and around the globe. How could anyone, even Germans, bring themselves to murder thousands and thousands of people in cold blood? Why, you can't believe it. It would be the end of all things. They'll never do it. Never. The United Kingdom removed all road signs in hopes that if the Nazis mounted a ground invasion, they would get lost and have trouble navigating. Back then, there was no major freeways, so navigating from one city to another was not easy without directions. In 1940, a government-sponsored scheme known as the Corb Scheme evacuated children out of Britain in an attempt to keep them safe from the coming war with Germany. Corb stood for Children of the Overseas Reception Board. Between June and August 1940, the government scheme had received over 200,000 applications, and over a 3-month period, 2,664 children were evacuated from Britain to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. A further 24,000 children had been approved for sailing when, on 17 September 1940, a German U-boat fired a torpedo at a passenger ship called the City of Benares while it was crossing the Atlantic. The ship was struck down at 10 in the evening, 600 miles from land. Only 19 of the children survived. Those who managed to escape to lifeboats had to wait almost 24 hours to be rescued. One lifeboat that drifted too far was only found by accident after being adrift for 8 days. The consequences of the attack were devastating, even by wartime standards, and it marked the end of all overseas evacuation from Britain, both public and private. 70 Corb children were among 134 passengers killed, along with 131 of the crew. Loss of life was exacerbated by severe weather during the night, which included gale force winds, storms, rain, and hail. That is my worst nightmare. Imagine surviving the ship sinking, only to be washed out to sea in total darkness. Appearing shocked, but grateful to be alive, Mary Cornish stands aboard the destroyer HMS Anthony shortly after her rescue. Ms. Cornish was a volunteer escort for the children. Hitler ordered his navy to set up a blockade of Great Britain in hopes of starving its citizens. When the U-boat crew got back to their base in France and discovered that the Benares's cargo had been children, most of them burst into tears. After the war, the captain of the U-boat, Heinrich Bleikrad, was arrested, but was later acquitted after the Allies agreed with his defense that he and the crew did not know children were on board the ship because the ship was not marked as an evacuation vessel. The U-boat commander never apologized to the survivors or relatives of the dead. The picture of Untold internment camp, situated on the Isle of Man from 1943 to 1945. From the outbreak of the Second World War to June 1940, German and Austrian civilians living in the UK were classed as enemy aliens. Tribunal boards held across the country determined whether those aged between 16 and 70 were to be placed into captivity. They came up with 3 categories. Those considered to be a threat to national security were identified as Category A and found themselves detained in camps, most of which were on the Isle of Man. Category B, aliens, were subject to certain restrictions, while Category C aliens were exempt from both internment and restrictions. By the outbreak of World War II, in September 1939, Anderson shelters had been installed in the gardens of around 1.5 million houses in the areas most expected to be targeted by the Luftwaffe. A further 2.1 million were installed over the course of the war. Anderson shelters were issued free to all households who earned less than 250 British pounds a year, and those with higher incomes were charged 7 British pounds, which is about $750 today. Sometimes poor people would allow their rich neighbors in to share their shelter. They were made from 6 curved sheets bolted together at the top, so it wasn't too difficult for householders to build the shelters themselves. Anderson shelters were effective only if half buried in the ground and covered in a thick layer of earth. Families had to install their own bunk beds. If there was a toilet at all, it took the form of a bucket in the corner. Some families slept in them every night. Most people were reluctant to use them except after the air raid sirens had sounded. A November 1940 survey found that 27% of Londoners used Anderson shelters, 9% slept in public shelters, and 4% used the underground railway stations. Some people felt that if they were going to die, they would rather die in the comfort of their own home. One person online said that they erected their shelter indoors and covered it with sandbags. It would probably be the same today. How many times do we hear about people refusing to evacuate even when there's a hurricane? After the war, the shelters were collected by authorities, and homeowners were given the option of buying them for £1. From Ian Kershaw's book, Hitler, page 570. Despite Hitler's orders that he alone was to decide on terror bombing, 100 planes of the Luftwaffe, acting, it seems, under a loosely worded directive from Göring, had attacked London's East End on the night of 24 August 1940. As retaliation, the RAF carried out the first British bombing raids on Berlin the following night. Hitler regarded the bombing of Berlin as a disgrace. His reaction was to threaten massive retaliation. From 7 September, the nightly bombing of London began. This picture of young Jewish women in Ashishkas is said to have been taken sometime just before the town was invaded by Nazis on 21st September 1941. The identities of the women are unknown. We don't even know their first names. What makes this picture so ominous is the fact the Nazis executed every Jewish person they found in the town. The women look happy and seem unaware of the cruel fate about to befall on them. After the German army invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, a new stage in the Holocaust began. The Germans changed tactics from forced emigration and imprisonment of Jews to mass executions. Special action squads, the Einsatzgruppen, were created under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking SS officer. These units were made up of Nazi SS units and local collaborators from the occupied regions, mostly Ukrainians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, who aided these German mobile killing squads by serving as volunteer policemen. These units moved with speed behind the front lines of the advancing German army. Their main task was to carry out mass shootings of Jews, Romani people, members of opposing political groups, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The units summoned their victims to report at a central point or rounded them up in raids. Then, they executed them on the edge of ravines or alongside the mass graves that they had to dig themselves. At first, the mobile killing squads executed only Jewish men, but soon they moved on to all Jewish men, women, and children, without regard for age or gender. By the spring of 1943, the mobile killing squads have executed more than 1 million Jews and tens of thousands of political opponents, Roma, Chi, Gypsy people, the disabled, and anyone they deemed undesirable, which included anyone caught helping the Jews. On 21st September 1941, the eve of the Jewish New Year, a mobile killing squad entered Ishishki, a small town in what is now Lithuania. The killing squad members herded 4,000 Jews from the town and the surrounding region into 3 synagogues, where they were locked in and held for 2 days without food or water. They ordered some of the men to dig large trenches in the cemeteries. Then, it took another 2 days to move the Jewish men, women, and children to the cemeteries, where they were lined up in front of the open pits and executed. The shooting itself was carried out by the Lithuanian collaborators. Today, there are no more Jews in Ishishki. It was just one of hundreds of cities and towns whose Jews were completely wiped out during the Holocaust. The rich culture of most of these Jewish communities was lost forever. One of the most notorious massacres took place at the ravine of Babi Jar, near Kiev, Ukraine, in September 1941. An attack by the Soviet Secret Service had damaged the army headquarters of the Germans. So in retaliation, the Nazis decided to exterminate all the Kiev Jews immediately. Einsatzgruppe C put up pamphlets summoning the Jewish residents of Kiev to assemble on Melnik Street for resettlement outside the city. In reality, those who report were directed along Melnik Street toward the Jewish cemetery and to the ravine called Babi Yar. Jews were then forced to hand over their valuables, to undress, and to move into the ravine in groups of about 50 at a time. The German killing squads and Ukrainian auxiliary units would then open fire, and the next group would be told to get in, on top of the previous group, who were now deceased. This massacre in Ukraine continued non-stop for 2 days straight. About 34,000 Jews, men, women, and children, were wiped out in this operation. Imagine the terror of standing in the queue for 2 days, awaiting your turn to be executed. Imagine the fear, the helplessness, panic, and finally acceptance. Acceptance that there was nothing you could do to stop this. It's also important to emphasize that the men who executed these orders were not violent criminals and hoodlums. They were ordinary men who volunteered or were conscripted into the German army. Many of them had wives and children back in Germany. Through propaganda and training, they were then taught that Jews were enemies of Germany. Many of them drank heavily to overcome feelings of guilt and dull their thoughts. When they talked about what they had done, they used code words like "give them the special treatment" and "complete the special action" to try and distance themselves from their terrible crimes. But even that wasn't enough. The soldiers started showing signs of depression, anxiety, and addictive behavior, which led to German scientists being tasked with coming up with other ways to exterminate the prisoners, which led to the development of the gas chambers and concentration camps. In the months that follow, thousands more Jews are shot at Babi Yar. Many non-Jews, including Roma and Soviet prisoners of war, are also killed in the ravine. More than 30,000 Jews obeyed the summons. Once they got there, they were forced to undress and hand over all their belongings. Then they were shot. Apparently, when the Nazis started running low on bullets, they would instruct their victims to line up their heads to try and execute multiple victims with one shot. That's how desensitized they became and showed just how little they thought of their victims. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered around 300,000 Jews. 6 months later, the number had risen to approximately 500,000. The victims were Jews, as well as tens of thousands of Soviet officials, partisans, disabled people, and Roma. The Einsatzgruppen were responsible for the deaths of approximately 1.5 to 2 million people. Their actions were part of the broader Holocaust and genocide perpetrated by Nazi Germany. After the war, many members of the Einsatzgruppen were tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Nuremberg trials. 14 were sentenced to death. Only 4 were executed. A man weeping as German soldiers marched through Paris. Taken on June 14, 1940, this image captures the heartbreak of a French man as German forces occupy Paris. Queen Elizabeth, working as a mechanic. During the war, then Princess Elizabeth served as a mechanic and driver, showing the British royal family's commitment to the war effort. A photograph of people in Leningrad collecting water from shell holes in the street, taken in 1941 during the siege. The tall building in the background is known as the Nevsky Prospect. The siege of Leningrad was a prolonged military siege undertaken by the Nazis and fellow Axis powers against the Soviet city of Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg. The siege became one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history due to the high number of casualties throughout its duration. Historians have classified it as a genocide because of the deliberate destruction of the city and the intentional starvation of its civilian population. An estimated 1.5 million people died as a result of the siege, mostly by starvation. Among its victims were the older brother, grandmother, and uncles of current Russian President Vladimir Putin. By Monday, September 8, German and Finnish forces surrounded the city, but Hitler didn't want them to take it because occupying the city would make them responsible for feeding the citizens. Once they cut off the railway supply to the city, German scientists determined that in a few weeks the residents would all have starved, including the resistance fighters. They then bombed the city from a distance. The Axis armies then laid siege to the city for 900 days and nights. It is clear Hitler intended to utterly destroy the city and its population. The following is a directive sent to Army Group North on 29 September 1941. After the defeat of Soviet Russia, there can be no interest in the continued existence of this large urban center. Following the city's encirclement, requests for surrender negotiations shall be denied, since the problem of relocating and feeding the population cannot and should not be solved by us. In this war for our very existence, we can have no interest in maintaining even a part of this very large urban population. What I found interesting was that the Nazis largely obeyed the rules of war when it came to the Russian people, like taking responsibility for feeding citizens, except when it came to Jewish people. The Soviets were constantly battling to get supplies to the city, and on some occasions succeeded, but it wasn't enough. Without access to food, hundreds, perhaps thousands, resorted to cannibalizing the dead, and in a few cases, people were murdered for their flesh. The Leningrad police struggled to keep order and even formed a special division to combat cannibalism. Civilians in the city suffered from extreme starvation, especially in the winter. From November 1941 to February 1942, the only food available to the citizen was 125 grams of bread per day, of which 50% consisted of sawdust. In conditions of extreme temperatures, down to negative 30 degrees Celsius, and with city transport out of service, even a distance of a few kilometers to a food distribution kiosk created an insurmountable obstacle for many citizens. Deaths peaked in January and February 1942 at 100,000 per month, mostly from starvation. People often died on the streets, and citizens soon became accustomed to the sight of death. The first reported case of human meat consumed as food was on 13th in December 1941. Other cases include a mother slaughtering her 18-month-old to feed her 3 older children, and a plumber who killed his wife to feed his sons and nieces. By December 1942, a year later, the NKVD had arrested 2,100 cannibals. Instances of person eating were significantly lower than that of corpse eating. Of the 300 people arrested in April 1942 for cannibalism, only 44 were murderers, and 64% of cannibals were female. Murder was actually more common than cannibalism among men, with the intent of stealing ration cards. The Soviet government awarded the Order of Lenin to the people of Leningrad in 1945, paying tribute to their endurance during the grueling siege. The USS Arizona in flames after Pearl Harbor. This iconic image shows the USS Arizona engulfed in flames following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on 7th December 1941, which led to the U.S. entering the war. German soldiers reacting to concentration camp footage in 1945. This photograph captures the horrified reactions of German soldiers as they are shown footage of the concentration camp's atrocities. The ruins of Dresden. After Allied bombing, taken in 1945, this photograph shows the devastating aftermath of the bombing of Dresden, Germany. General Eisenhower, speaking with paratroopers before D-Day. This image captures General Eisenhower giving a pep talk to paratroopers just before the D-Day invasion. Raising the flag on Iwo Jima. One of the most famous images of World War II, this photograph shows U.S. Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima. The Yalta Conference, a photograph of the 1945 meeting where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin discussed the post-war reorganization of Europe. Attack on USS Franklin. This dramatic image shows the USS Franklin ablaze after being hit by a Japanese air attack. Japanese child soldier. This image shows a young Japanese child soldier, highlighting the desperation of Japan in the war's final stages. Soviet snipers in 1945. A photograph showing Soviet snipers who played a crucial role in the Eastern Front battles. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the intent to conquer and enslave its people. In response, over 2,000 Russian women enlisted as snipers in the Soviet army. A U.S. Marine gives a cigarette to a Japanese soldier. Taken on Iwo Jima in 1945, this image symbolizes the complex human interactions amid the brutality of war. Liberation of Buchenwald. This image shows the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp. During the weeks before liberation, many of the boys knew that the Americans were close. They recalled hearing the shelling of the Allied forces near Buchenwald. This created tension in the camp because they knew the Nazis would try to destroy all evidence of their crimes, as many of the boys remembered them doing when Auschwitz was evacuated at the end of January, only a few months earlier. By the end of the first week in April, the evacuation of Buchenwald had begun. The SS officers removed most of the inmates and executed many in the nearby forest, while others were sent on death marches to other camps. On 9 and 10th of April, about 15,000 inmates had been transported out of the camp on foot. Tens of thousands perished this way. From 10 outer April, the boys waited in fear. Many searched for places to hide. Melbourne boy Jack Yu, who was in Block 66, described the day before liberation. He said that on the night of 9th of April, he and a few of his friends, who slept on the top of the bunks, made a hole in the ceiling. They crawled between the ceiling and the roof, intending to hide there until after liberation. However, the ceiling was not strong enough, so during the day of 10th of April, the ceiling collapsed and the young inmates fell to the floor. As punishment, the Germans were to take them out of the camp to be shot in the forest. However, while they were being taken, the Germans heard the American planes flying overhead. It was the boys' good fortune that the Germans fled, leaving the boys to run and find new hiding places, where they stayed until they were rescued the following day by the Americans. Many of the inmates who were not in Block 66 assembled on the main square, prior to being marched out of the camp. Some hid in latrines or other places. One of the Melbourne boys, Joe Kay, recalled that a Czech guard, a collaborator, pulled him and his brothers under a plank of wood, enabling them to hide and thereby survive the terrifying time just prior to liberation. On the morning of 11th April 1945, political prisoners began the liberation of Buchenwald, seizing the German posts as officers fled. In the afternoon of 11th April 1945, the American Third Army arrived to officially liberate the camp. These images offer a powerful visual history of World War II, depicting the courage, tragedy, and pivotal moments that defined the conflict.